and welcome to this episode of Live with Lizzie Lee, powered by the China Project. I am your host, Lizzie. Joining me today is Lynette Ong, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for being here with me, Professor Ong.
Thank you so much for having me, Lizzie.
So, Professor Ong, can you please help us understand the Weiwen model? What are its features and what are its advantages?
So Weiwen means maintaining stability, and in Western social science terms, it could be loosely translated into a repressive model. But China's definition of repression is much broader than we understand in the West. We typically understand in the West repression as police arrest, rolling in military tank to repress protesters. Those are things that happen. The government take actions after small protests or large-scale demonstrations have taken place. So they are kind of ex-post measures to deal with social unrest. That's the definition in the West. But in terms of Weiwen in Chinese terms, they are looking at doing things to nip contention in the bud before they actually evolve into protests. So you can imagine that include a wide range of measures. So when we talk about Weiwen in China, it could include things such as deploying or planting spies in the university, in workplaces, either through party apparatus or recruiting volunteers. It could involve, if you live in the building blocks, you are assigned in a grid, and you have part of the social credit system and part of the grid control. 网格化管理 is to divide the cities into grid, and each grid is then assigned to a grid worker or a grid officer to monitor. So you might have, let's say, 50 households living in the grid, and each household has about 3 to 4 people. So this grid worker is in charge of monitoring people behavior. So those with criminal background, those who have lodged a petition, then they have left a record with the government. These people would be watched much more closely than someone with a clean record. And also you also have technology surveillance with state-of-the-art artificial intelligence enablers that allow the state that could then track you down. And during COVID times, everyone needs to carry app and then screen their app, which could turn into red, orange, or green, depending on their COVID status, supposedly. But COVID app has been used to not allow people to, let's say, to board a train if they want to go to big cities to protest. Some local governments have used that sort of measures to stop people from controlling their movement. So a range of things that take place in order to preempt protests from taking place. And
Right.
of course, after protest has taken place, they could send in the police, they could send in the military, they could send in, gangsters, hooligans, or what I call thugs for hire. So a whole range of things along the value chain is what, the Chinese mean by the Weiwen system. Is a system that is intent to really to minimize or to preempt any sort of large scale protest or demonstration.
Right, we usually have this impression that the Chinese Weiwen system is quite successful in nipping protests in its bud. What went wrong with this approach this time as we see multiple protests erupting across China?
That's a really great question, because as what I've described earlier, that sort of system you can imagine actually requires a great deal of manpower, whether to monitor people, to spy on people, or even to assign a grid to someone. It requires a lot of manpower, it requires a lot of money. So they cannot monitor everybody, right? It's impossible to monitor everybody. They can only monitor those people who are high-risk individuals, those people who have lodged a petition before, who have tried to protest before. If you get into the government list, you very difficult to get out of it. So those people who have turned up the street across a lot of cities, more than a dozen cities in the past week, most of them have very clean records. So the government, the party, has no right to suspect them. Has no reason to be suspicious of these people. So they have really escaped the holes of the system. There are big holes in the system. The system is sure very powerful, very pervasive, but is meant to be targeting individuals, not the broad society at large.
Fantastic. Speaking of the ongoing protests, there has been some debate on whether these protests are about specific piece of COVID policy or implementation of those COVID policies or broader grievances against the regime or Xi Jinping's rule. Professor Wang, what's your take on that aspect?
So initially they were about about frustrations that deal with that are COVID related, but this sort of COVID related is actually very all encompassing. There are people who are just fed up with taking COVID tests. They want more freedom. We're not talking about liberty or democracy. We're just talking about the movement, the ability to move around, to go to grocery store, to go about your everyday life. That sort of very limited daily lives sort of movement. There are people who have had their business income drastically reduced to none for a couple of months, or some of them being interrupted for 3 years already. So their income has been affected in a very significant way. You have workers in factories who complained about bad quarantine practices, pay being cut, not being paid properly, sent into quarantine with unhygienic conditions, just terrible. So they would rather walk for a couple of days back to the villages to escape that sort of conditions, given that they are not being paid properly. You also have more intellectuals in the cities, such as in very prestigious campuses in big universities like Tsinghua in Beijing and some university in Shanghai, and those were students who actually go out there and say that down with we don't want to take any COVID tests anymore. Down with Xi Jinping, down with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. But I think the most recent trigger is actually the Urumqi fire. So in Urumqi, about a week ago, 10 people died of fire. They were trapped in the building. Fire engine cannot get to the building and rescue them, which they could under ordinary conditions. The fire engine couldn't reach them because of the place were cordoned off because of quarantine. So people died unnecessarily. That provoked huge outrage. So usually what happened in ethnic minority region in China, right, doesn't have much resonance across Han society. But this time is a little bit different because they feel that they died because of COVID restrictions. We are also suffering under COVID restrictions here. So this sort of sympathy across the nation is very, very rare. And they have actually broken the psychological barrier this time. So you see people congregating in Shanghai, Urumqi, Zhonglu. It's just a name, right? Aside from the names, there's no ethnic Uyghurs there. So they go out to Urumqi, Zhonglu and say that done with we don't want to take any COVID tests anymore. Done with Xi Jinping. We want freedom. Xi Jinping should step down.
Fantastic. So last month, the debate on how strong Xi Jinping's power grip on China seemed all but settled as Xi Jinping secured an unprecedented third term and stacked the standing committee with his loyalists. But now, as the protest happening all around China, that debate, that discussion has reopened. Do you think Xi Jinping's power is weakened by those protests in any meaningful way? How do you expect Beijing to react in the aftermath of those protests?
Sure. So I think Xi Jinping's power, even at the 20th Party Congress, when I saw him line up the institutions, the elite institutions, Politburo, Standing Committee, Politburo, and Central Committee, with all his loyalists, is actually an indication that the system itself is very fragile. Because China being such a big country, there's no way that you can buy loyalty of everybody, right? So he has replaced people. Chinese system. What holds Chinese system together? Since 改革开放, since liberal reform in 1979, it is really about allowing people to get rich. It is really about allowing civil servants, bureaucrats, especially politicians, to make money on the sideline through various means, using their status, using their official positions. Right? And that's how people buy into the system. That's how people become loyal to the CCP, because they can gain something out of it. But what Xi Jinping did was he got rid of the glue, what I would call the glue that held the system together for a long time, and replaced that with people who are loyal to him. And why are people loyal to him? If they cannot gain benefits, they have to be fearful of him, right? So that sort of fear that held people together is actually not as strong as, I would say, commercial incentives, right? Like positive incentives that allow people to get rich. So even though at the top of the institutions, he is able to line up with loyalists, people see that. And at the bottom, people do not resonate with Xi Jinping. And Chinese society in the last 3 years is really like a pressure cooker. It has been a pressure cooker for a long time because it's a stressful and highly competitive society. And I think the last 3 years with lockdown on and off, and declining economy, people pay money, can never get their houses, mortgage crisis, tanking economic growth, unemployment rate, particularly among the youth in the cities, is like as high as 20% now. It's a system that is under a lot of pressure. I'm not saying that the system will collapse anytime soon, but I'm really saying the system is really not as strong as we have thought, as it appears to be just a month ago at the 20th Party Congress.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.